lost my train of thought now. So can you just talk us through briefly the changes that have occurred in the US and the UK, and do they achieve the kind of regime that you just talked about with the chair, that everyone does fall under the same set of rules, and I assume they are graduated in some sense, so as you get into larger aircraft, yes, as you get into carrying more than one passenger, things do become more complex and the requirements are greater. So can you talk us briefly through how the US and the UK system have dealt with this, different to the Australian environment?
Well, firstly, Senator, I think the first statement that we should make in reflection of this is that both the UK and the US aviation regulatory system is a unified single system, meaning that there are no self-administrations, there are no privatised subsections of its roles, duties and responsibilities. They produce a framework. That regulatory safety framework is used by all participants, and everybody understands the rules that they are to adhere to. The difference principally here in Australia is that over the past 25, 30 years, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority has promoted the ideal of creating sectors that effectively are becoming privatised monopolies in themselves. If you are a pilot in Australia today and you would like to fly a glider, a light sport recreational aircraft, a warbird, a certified general aviation aircraft, and a gyrocopter, you have to be a paid-up financial member of 5 different organisations effectively. And that's a bizarre situation. I don't believe anywhere else in the world this is being replicated. And as a consequence of this sector privatisation, and that is exactly what is going on here, we are seeing the slow but determined privatisation of the sector regulation within the industry. And I'm sure I could have a 2-hour debate with the senators here on whether that's actually in the remit of CASA to be doing that. But as a consequence of doing this, we are now pitching the sectors in competition to one another on a bloodthirsty level. Each of these organisations are doing exactly what they should be doing, and that is they are strengthening their competitive advantages and they are competing within the aviation ecosystem or economy for larger slices of the pie. And we are right now seeing this play out in terms of the way in which there's the renegotiation, Peter, of the ASAC funding, where now we have real competition in the space that's resulting in real feuds over how these organisations should receive their CASA funding. Is this good for the long-term aviation economy and ecosystem? Certainly it is not. And I know it's a difficult conversation and it's a difficult subject, and it attracts the ire of the self-administrations to say this. But what's happening is we are losing the perspective on the national interest in exchange for the perspective of self-interest. And as we move further and further down that road, we're going to see further division within the industry. In relation to the medical reform process, the UK and the US both moved towards a private driver's licence standard. Both the US and the UK recognised that the higher standards of medical certification were a barrier to entry, and the costs involved in processing through those medicals were becoming higher and higher. The UK and the US have both put financial estimates as to what those costs were, and I'm happy to take it on notice, senators, and provide all of that information, along with providing a detailed breakdown of the comparison of the medical certification privileges. But the essential central ingredient in this is that it is based on a private driver's licence standard, and there's a reason for it. They're private pilots. We have a bizarre situation in Australia where CASA are promoting the differentiation of private and recreational. Can anyone explain this? What's the difference between a private pilot and a recreational pilot? There's no difference. They're exactly the same. Both pilots fly on the weekend. Both pilots fly for no hire or reward. Both pilots are out there enjoying aviation as a hobby and a pursuit. But for some reason, we're now separating recreational from private, and we're creating a real differential in the medical certification standard.
So where would station owners and farmers fall? Private. Right.
And unfortunately, senators, this is a section of the community that's really feeling it now. I've got so many station owners that will phone up and say, Ben, I've got to sell that GA aeroplane because I just can't pass the medical anymore. And as my colleagues from the RAAus will attest, this is impacting our maintenance engineering fraternity. We are watching the capability and sustainability of our general aviation maintenance community decline rapidly, because people are selling general aviation aircraft not because they don't want them, not because they're not practical, not because they're not useful, simply because they can't maintain a CASA medical.
Mr. Talbot, sorry, just lastly from me, Mr. Talbot, can you just talk us through that issue, the impact on your members, what's happening to the businesses that support the general aviation sector?
Well, I think the AMROBA members are seeing, an exodus of recreational and private pilots, particularly from the sector. There's been a few other considerations, I think, in recent years. If you owned a Cessna, we had the SIDS program, which meant that a lot of aircraft had to have significant maintenance done to them. So quite a few aircraft had gone at that point. But yeah, I think we are seeing a decline in the use of general aviation aircraft.
We'll have to go to Senator Patrick. Senator Patrick.
Yeah, look, I just wanted to get away from different classes of people, whether they're private or they're recreational, to the sort of root analysis of this. So you heard the evidence I took from the previous witnesses, where it was explained that perhaps a greater medical standard is required because a private pilot is flying a more complex aircraft or more complex operations because they perhaps go into controlled airspace. I would have thought that training would have, in some sense, countered the stress level, because there's more training involved in that. Is that? Would you share that view?
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail right on the head, and that's you gave certainly the Warbirds guys and the parachute guys the perfect opportunity to speak to that training. But if I could answer that same question, it's all training. I mean, you're either fit to fly or you're not fit to fly. It's a black and white issue. The additional information that Mr. King gave, that each pilot is required to make that assessment on the day they go flying, whether they are fit. We all have to do that under the law. Doesn't matter what our medical classification is. The crux of the problem here is, as a private and or recreational pilot, why have we got a different medical standard? If self-certifying medical declaration is safe and signed off as safe by CASA, then that medical class is fit for everybody who is operating a private recreational flight, regardless of their registration mark on their aeroplane or the weight of their aeroplane. And I bring in the weight because most recently RAAus have applied for 1,500 kilos increase in weight, which will take in most of the general aviation fleet used for private recreational flight.
So around 8,000 kilos, is that right?
No,
1,500.
1,500 kilos.
Extra?
No, total.
Okay.
And CASA has come out and basically made some statements that they're thinking about 760 kilos as a halfway measure, and the statement was made publicly that we'll have a look at that, and if they achieve safety at that level of 760 kilos, we'll look at 1,500 kilos. The reason I'm talking about this is because it's all about, as you said, Senator, training. Weight and registration mark has nothing to do with medical. Medical is either fit to fly or not fit to fly. So why do we have differing standards?
And I would have gone, perhaps asked the question, I know, Mr Morgan, you might have said this flippantly, but I would have thought the airspace in the United States and in the UK is in fact different to Australia in terms of congestion and in terms of much harsher weather conditions. I've never had to sit on a runway in Australia and have de-icing occurring. So,
Senator, you're absolutely correct.
So
you've nailed that one. They do face far more challenging weather conditions than we do here in Australia, which just further amplifies the disparity in the system that we have. And I think just to add a little bit to what Mr White is saying, I heard the comment from the RAAus chair, or acting chair, that correction, it was from Spencer Ferrier, that the RAAus system has been set up to deal with the simpler aircraft. And I think that we've got to be careful in looking at that statement and putting way too much of a stamp on it. And that is, these aircraft today, when the RAAus, go back in time, 10, 15 years ago, the RAAus were flying aeroplanes with pretty much rag and tube ultralights. A great number of aeroplanes with chainsaw motors on them virtually. These things were pretty experimental, pretty wild, Wild West type of airplanes. But the type of aircraft that the RAAus are flying today are, for all intent and purpose, a general aviation aircraft. So much so that a significant number of these types are now being used by flight training organisations nationwide. And so are we in fact, is CASA in fact providing liberalisation for simplified aircraft, or are we now providing liberalisation for a pseudo general aviation? And I'm often confused when I look at the general aviation economy now and I go to a flight school and I see a flight school buying up a whole bunch of RAAus aircraft, and I say to them, why are you putting RAAus airplanes online here with a flight school? And they say, it's pretty simple. The students don't have to go through half the turmoil they have to go through with CASA. We don't have to go through half the turmoil we go through with maintaining it, because we can obtain our own maintenance approvals. We can put our own people through a simplified RAAus maintenance course and we can own and maintain the aircraft. They're cheaper to run. And so there's a very good reason as to why we're seeing proliferation in this space. We're seeing proliferation and we're seeing rapid growth in RAAus because it's a sad indictment of the failure of CASA to actually reform our system. And if CASA had taken a centralised reform approach to our overall regulatory framework and provided universal reform in terms of improving the system, then we would have seen general aviation flight schools bringing these aircraft in and we would have had overall growth. But instead, we've got this bizarre situation where we're seeing growth in an environment that can really only be categorised as a state-sponsored monopoly. And it is a state-sponsored monopoly because it can't exist without the special conditions and alleviances that CASA provided, whether it be through supplemental funding, whether it be through reformed medical standards, the allowance to maintain your own aeroplanes. It doesn't matter which way we look at this. This thing is sponsored by CASA. Now, we're not asking for it to be removed. What we're asking for is our National Aviation Safety Regulator to do the job of providing the national general aviation economy with a fair, equitable and balanced regulatory environment so that we all have opportunity.
Okay,